realized last time this was a little bit larger. This is because the AP wants you to make sure that you have covered the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as you are going through this section. So you've already annotated the Declaration of Independence if you're watching this. And so this is more the Constitution, as we talked about sort of the rationale behind the Declaration of Independence in our last video / previously in class. So, ideals of democracy. At the end of the day, what do the Founding Fathers want to achieve? What is sort of their goal, their thesis, if you will, behind writing the Constitution? And the answer is literally given in the preamble. I assume a good number of you had to memorize this in like middle school. I'm sorry, memorizing speeches is boring. We're not going to make you do that. That would be weird. So here's the deal. We're going to go through this and sort of break down what the goals here were. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. There's a much longer version of this that's edited. If you ever get to Philadelphia and get to go to the Constitution Center, there's a really cool room there where they have the original draft or drafts of the Constitution that Madison had written, and then it's all of the edits and what eventually comes out of it. And there's an explanation for basically every single argument that was had during the Constitutional Convention, which is what we'll be talking about today, as to why that original version doesn't stick together. So like the First Amendment was originally like 7 amendments that everybody's like, what if we just kind of mush this all together, because it's the same philosophy behind all of it and we can just do it in a more coherent fashion. So let's jump into that, shall we? Form a more perfect union. We're not going to watch that link on the right because it's cursed. So, states are going to work together. The Articles of Confederation were good. Remember, the word here is more perfect union. They're still saying, hey, we had a perfect union. We're great. We know what we're doing. It's better than what we had with Great Britain. We're going to make it even better. States are going to work with the federal government. They will not work in opposition to the federal government. They will not collaborate with the federal government either. The union works because that federal government is there. The states have a voice, but at the end of the day, the federal government calls the shots. So, we're great. We can do even better. And because it's already perfect, non-democratic government ain't going to cut it. In this case, democratic government, they just mean a government by the people. We will get more explicitly into republicanism as we move forward. Establish justice is exactly what it sounds like. The rights of the people shall not be infringed upon. All of the abusive taxes and lack of voice that were seen by the colonists in the British aren't going to be there anymore. The people have rights. We are going to articulate them. So remember this from your U.S. history class, and we'll touch on it again towards the end of this. The Constitution is written with the understanding that Madison is already hard at work on a Bill of Rights that will spell out what exactly the rights of the citizenry are in America, and to make sure that there's no way those can be excluded. That's one of kind of the final hurdles for writing the Constitution and getting it enacted, is that guarantee of a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. The law will be equally applied, equally kind of like everybody was equal at the Constitutional Convention is a relative term here. This doesn't apply to slaves, it doesn't apply to women, or Native Americans. So the Native Americans one is sort of weird here. George Washington makes a really strong and well-documented defense of Native Americans and how they needed to be treated as their own nations inside the United States and have the requisite protections thereof. And he signs a number of documents and really demands that the U.S. government follow along with that. But as Washington heads out, future presidents are far less cognizant of the rights of Native Americans and are far more willing to step all over them. But got to give George his due where it's there. He really does try to get along with the Native American tribes, not take over their land, and negotiate with them as he would negotiate with the English or the French or whomever, and not as just people living in his country taking up land that he wanted. Laws are going to be authored and implemented by what's set out in the Constitution. There is your establishment of justice. The legislative branch is going to write a constitution. The legislative branch, following the enactment of that constitution, is going to then write laws that are in keeping with the Constitution. Remember, if there's any question, and we will talk about this in the next video, the Constitution is the supreme document, and any laws written by Congress or by a state government at the end of the day are answerable to the Constitution. That's what the Supreme Court's there for. And also, this is just a hard shot at the British, that they did not establish justice, they passed laws and then didn't enforce them equally. So, there's established justice. We're not going to infringe upon your rights, people will be treated equally, and the laws will be written by your elected representatives. Ensure domestic tranquility. This one's a little vaguer, but this is basically saying, hey, you'll be able to feel safe inside of this country. So, peace, freedom, order. They're looking to treat you right. They don't want to exploit the people, so we don't want to have any sort of political upheaval over, abuses in various states. Everyone, like we said earlier, will be treated equally. We don't want to exploit the people, but laissez-faire capitalism, especially until we get to really the 1890s, 1900s, is going to be there and is going to lead to the exploitation of people, but laws will enable us to eventually stop that. So that's a quickie. Provide for the common defense. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, there's no standing army and there's no way to pay the one we've got. People are going to be protected here. Remember, this is not the common offense, it's the common defense. There's nothing specifically in there about various branches of the military or creating a militia. It's just going to basically say, yes, the government will protect you, the people. As we said, solves a major issue there. We have the French to our west. Eventually, Jefferson will rectify that with the Louisiana Purchase. The Spanish to the south, we will buy up Florida by 1818, 1820. And that should say Canada, but we've got this picture from Life magazine here instead. And Canada to the north. And remember, Canada is still a British dominion, and they will invade us multiple times in the War of 1812. So, nowadays, we don't really think of this as an issue, right? We're friends with Canada, and we get along relatively well with Mexico. Nobody else is coming for us. It's not like the Bahamas are going to invade anytime soon. So we feel pretty content. Until that manifest destiny really, takes over, though, and we end up taking over the majority of the continent, there's a general fear of America being able to be invaded. Americans don't feel safe at sea. That's the cause of the War of 1812, right? So by providing this common defense, by eventually funding an army and a navy and enable us to hire pirates with privateers, that's an awesome thing we'll talk about later. Founding Fathers really want to make it clear that part of the Constitution here is to make sure that Americans feel safe. This doesn't have anything to do with the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment speaks for itself. For the most part, we'll get into that later as well. This is written beforehand, and so this is not an allusion to what the intent of the Second Amendment is. Like I said, the Bill of Rights is written after the Constitution to ensure that everybody signs up for the Constitution. So keep that sort of timeline in mind as we go here. Promote the general welfare. This is a big one. This is Alexander Hamilton's doing, no question about it. Government's going to look out for the best interest of the people. Yeah, that's very sweet. This is the key here. Providing for the general welfare means that we need to pay for stuff. We already talked about debt. This is going to help us pay off the national debt. This is going to help us pay for a military. This is going to help us pay for infrastructure, eventually for building Washington, D.C. Anything that the country needs to make it go smoothly, the general welfare, can be used here to point to the general welfare and tap at the very top of the Constitution, right here in the preamble, and say, look, we need to pay for this stuff. It's the general welfare. Later on, we will get to something called the Elastic Clause. These go hand in hand. Do you need to help farmers out to make sure that they don't go bankrupt and, we still have farms in the United States? Yep, cool. It's the general welfare. Pay for it. We need a bigger army? Pay for it. Taxes. Infrastructure, we need bridges, we need highways, we need, holes blown through the side of mountains, we need canals in upstate New York. Sweet. It's the general welfare. It's going to help out the country. Anything, you name it, this is a blank check, and it's incredibly important. And it is good foreshadowing, at the very least, for the Elastic Clause later on, and to a lesser extent, the Supremacy Clause. So here are the blessings of liberty. The Constitution is going to be in place for a long time. And the key thing here is the second part of this, for ourselves and our posterity, for future generations, right? And by doing this, this is also sort of an unintentional shot at Jefferson with his whole, we're going to need to, overthrow the government every 20 years and start anew, is instead America saying, look, we built in a model here for passing amendments. So we don't need to tear down the entire Constitution because one part of it doesn't work. Instead, we can modify the Constitution and change as necessary over time, right? We're going to pass the 18th Amendment. We're going to outlaw alcohol. We're going to realize that is a bad counterproductive idea, and we're going to pass the 21st Amendment that will wipe out the 18th Amendment. That's the only way you can do that. That is enshrined right here. The blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We will change the Constitution to ensure that the people get what they want. We want this to last. We stood up, created our own country for a reason. We want to continue that product. All right, this is just sort of a ballpark for where we're going for here. So think of this as your table of contents. Let's jump into actually ratifying the Constitution. All right, so our first big plan for the Constitution is offered up by Virginia. In Virginia, or as I like to call it, the big baller plan because it's large and obnoxious and not particularly well thought out, is this. They want a bicameral legislature. So they want two houses in the legislature. So you can call it House A and House B. Both houses were going to have representatives in them, which obviously that makes sense. However, this is where it differs from the United States. Both houses would have those representatives determined by state population. The larger states would get more representatives in both House A and House B. Virginia plan is going big here. Remember, Virginia, with all those anti-federalists, is pretty afraid of having its power stripped from it by smaller voices, which is kind of weird considering that they're also, the party of the people, if you will. But the key here to remember with Virginia plan, bicameral and both houses determined by state population. They want a strong national government, but the best way in their eyes for that to happen is to have the voices of the big states heard most often. And when I say big states, I mean big by population, not by square mileage. Size does not matter. Excuse me. So, key to the Virginia plan, state population, state population, state population. Virginia, Pennsylvania, to a lesser extent New York, going to be all over this one. They would be the ones to benefit, whereas states like Massachusetts, or especially the more southern states like South Carolina and Georgia, would be getting the short shrift here. So, Virginia plan. Again, I cannot stress this enough. Key it in with state population and bicameral legislature. Next, we've got the New Jersey plan. There's no good nickname for this, which is why I call it the Tim Duncan plan. It is fundamentally sound, but it's kind of boring to look at. In their case, they want a unicameral legislature. They're going to say, you know what? Let's have fewer voices here. We don't want as much of a national government, and we can do that by just hearing fewer voices. We'll hear a couple voices from each state, and we'll make our decisions there. The key here is that all states get the same number of representatives. It makes sense. We're all equal in this country, so it should not matter if you are Rhode Island or Virginia. Your voice should matter the same. Now, hopefully, the gears are turning in your head and you're saying, well, some of the big baller plan here, some of the Virginia plan sounds really familiar. I certainly know that at least one house in the Congress has its seats determined by state population. But I also know that there's one house that all has the same number of representatives, no matter if it is California or Wyoming. So, little states are all in favor of the New Jersey plan. How do we get to where we're at today? And we come to one of my personal favorite people in American history, not Kevin Durant. This gentleman right here, Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman is going to take the best of what he's got to offer, what everybody else has to offer as well, and sort of mush it together and create a championship compromise out of all of this. That's why this is the Kevin Durant plan. He takes his own skills, he combines them with the skills of, Steve Kerr, Clay, Steph, Draymond, puts all that together and says, all right, we can win here. Let's do this. So this is either called the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. AP doesn't care which way you go. I tend to call it the Connecticut Compromise just because it's easy to remember along with Virginia and New Jersey. You have three states and they come together. So Roger Sherman is going to negotiate between the Virginia plan advocates and the New Jersey plan advocates and say, how about we do this instead? We will create an upper house, the Senate. 2 members per state. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Doesn't matter if you are the biggest state by population, the smallest state by population, you get 2 representatives. And you're going to serve there for 6 years. By serving there for 6 years, we will talk about this at length this year, you will be sort of immunized against the fickle will of the people. So this is sort of the rich people's house in that regard, is you get there and you can make unpopular decisions, and you'll be there for a while. So you can make those unpopular decisions that the common folk wouldn't understand. And by the time you're up for election, hopefully the common folk have come around to you. But he also says, let's have a lower house, a House of Representatives. From there, we'll draft off of the Virginia plan. It'll be what's called proportional representation. So that will be determined by the size of the population in your state. So Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, you'll get a bunch of representatives here. But in exchange for getting them, you're going to have to re-elect them every 2 years. So these guys, this lower house here, is there to speak for the little guy. If the person you represented is doing a poor job, guess what? They're only there for another 18 months tops, and then you can elect somebody who will do a better job. So what Roger Sherman has done with the Connecticut Compromise, with the Great Compromise, is taken the best aspects of both the Virginia and the New Jersey plans and formed them into a winning combination. Make sure you remember these 3 plans. They are a big, big, big deal. Now, that's not the end of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention is going to go on for months and months and months. In the summer in Pennsylvania, it is hot. I'm speaking from experience here. I was there last year. That's where I took my wonderful picture with Roger Sherman. It is humid. They have the doors the doors are closed and the windows are actually nailed shut and boarded over, so people can't come listen and report on stuff that is still in the process of being done. People are also coming in and out of this. The big players, Hamilton, Madison, Sherman, are going to stick around for the whole thing, but sometimes states will recall representatives or send them back, or bring them back, give them a briefing and say, all right, go advocate for this, that, or the other thing. So here are the big compromises that go into the Constitution. The first is the 3/5 compromise, which you are familiar with because of United States history. So the southern states have a large population, in large part due to the fact that there are a number of people that they have enslaved there. So the southern states are agriculture based, right? So they say, hey, we want to count them as people so we can get as many seats as possible in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. And the northern states look at that and say, you guys are monsters. You're saying that the slaves aren't people when it comes to treating them like people, but they're people for the sake of you getting more voices and getting to push your pro-slavery agenda more loudly in the House of Representatives. That's garbage. We don't want that. So what they decide to do is slaves will count as 3/5 of a person when determining population. So each slave is only 60% of a person. They do still not get to vote. The only people voting here at this time and all through slavery times are only going to be white men. In the case of South Carolina, it's going to be white landowning men until like the 1840s, because as I said earlier, South Carolina is a garbage hellhole of a state. Now, the North says only free men should get to vote and only be counted as people that get to vote, right? Because that will accelerate the decline of slavery. And as the South, they wanted everything done so they could have their cake and eat it too. They're going to end up with the 3/5 compromise. There is a sort of subsidiary compromise that goes along with this on the importation of slaves. Eventually, there is an agreement reached where no laws on slavery can be passed until 25 years after ratification. Almost immediately after that, Congress is going to pass what's called the Non-Importation Act, and slavery will no longer allow importation into the United States. So slaves that live in the United States and their descendants can still be enslaved, but no longer can they be imported from Africa. That's not going to put a full stop to it. There's a really interesting book out there called Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston that interviews the last living slave to be imported into America, who lives in Georgia in like the 1820s. It's a true story. It's really interesting. But the importation of slaves and the subsequent Non-Importation Act are another compromise that needs to get in there and does. This next one is going to be the biggest one because it's going to have the longest ripple effect. Obviously, this is probably the most impactful of these little compromises, but by the time we get to 1866, it does not have a legal impact anymore. But the Commerce Clause is. This is going to say that only Congress can regulate international and interstate commerce. So commerce is trade. Later on, there will be some dispute as to what exactly we mean by commerce, because theoretically, commerce could mean the sharing of ideas through conversation and talk. So think of that as like intellectual property rights. That will get worked in later on. But right here, what we're trying to do is fix the problem that we saw with the Articles of Confederation, is how do we stop, let's say North Carolina from making a sweetheart deal with France, and so France only imports goods into North Carolina, and then everybody's got to pay a premium to go to North Carolina and trade with them. Federal government says no. Any international trade is only going to be dealt with at the national level. So states can't make preferential deals with foreign powers. The same thing goes with interstate commerce. So North Carolina can't tax South Carolina goods that are going through it on their way to Virginia. All states have to treat each other equally when it comes to business. South fears the outlawing of the slave trade. They put up a fuss, but as we saw above, you get to the non-importation of slave stuff later on, and eventually the South shuts up because they need to be able to sell their stuff, right? They create raw materials. They don't produce anything on their own that's manufactured, so they need to be able to buy stuff from the North and from other countries. So they eventually play ball and agree to the Commerce Clause. Okay, this is sort of where we're going to wrap it up. What does American government sort of look like in the broad scope before we get into breaking down the Constitution bit by bit in the second half of this unit? It's checks and balances, which, as I said, is the crux of Unit 2 for the AP test, so we'll get into that later. But making sure that no one branch of government has absolute power over the others, that they all make sure that they all, work out. They're looking after each other. Different types of powers. I would like you to write these down. We will talk about these throughout the year, but it's a good thing to start being able to differentiate. First of all, you're going to have this idea of exclusive, or they're also called delegated powers, and those are powers that are only held by the federal government. Declarations of wars, international treaties, international trade agreements, kind of like we just talked about. Those are exclusive to the federal government. So we say they're exclusive because only the federal government has them. We say they're delegated because they were given to the federal government by the states when the Constitution was written. The states came together and said, hey, federal government, so we don't get into a slap fight over this from state to state, you take over. These are exclusively your powers. So exclusive and delegated powers mean the same thing, only held by the federal government. We can see this whole thing right here, lists them off. We will go through this again later on with more federalism fun. Then we've got concurrent powers, sometimes called shared powers. Concurrent powers is the best way to talk about them, though. Held by both the state and the federal government. So that would be passing laws. Sometimes you might get into a dispute over whose law takes primacy there. It'll always be the federal government. And taxation. We pay state taxes, we pay federal taxes. That's because they're concurrent powers held by both the national and the state government. Then you've got reserved powers. These are powers held only by the states. The federal government does not get to do this. One of the first Supreme Court cases we're going to talk about in a couple weeks, U.S. versus Lopez, is going to see this happen. Is a battle between the federal government arguing for the Commerce Clause and state governments arguing for reserved powers. And we'll see who comes out on top there. So reserved powers held only by the state. The big one there in your case is education. Yes, we have the U.S. Department of Education. Doesn't come about until the 60s and is largely powerless. They have a bunch of money, and that's really it. They can't actually force us to do anything. And then the 10th Amendment. That is powers held by the states. You will know all the amendments by the end of this. But here you go. So, marriage laws, public safety, so that's like speed limits in the state, that sort of thing. Establish local governments, regulate business within the state, so that would be intrastate commerce. All of that is a reserved power held only by the state. And then lastly, this is sort of a weird one, but it comes up every once in a while, so it's best to know it, and that is implied powers. These powers aren't spelled out anywhere. It's just sort of, hey, you're a government, of course you should do that. So that's something like maintain a border and make sure that your citizens are protected. So when I say citizens are protected, I'm not talking about passing any laws. It's just making sure that like your country is stable. So those are implied powers. We don't talk about that very much. So you should be able to differentiate, though, between delegated powers, concurrent powers, and reserved powers. Those are, remember, powers reserved by the state. That's why we call them reserved powers. We are a representative republic. We are not a democracy, as America is not a democracy. That is always a fun thing to do that will just make people angry. There's a great quote out there from Futurama that says, "You are technically correct, the best type of correct." It's annoying, but it's entertaining. So yeah, we are a representative republic. And America comes down to federalism. We share power between the national government and the state government. And we will go into that way more later on, as we will talk about federalism quite a bit. And that's going to do it. When we pick up next time, we will go through the entirety of the Constitution, bit by bit. You'll have analyzed it already. You will have hopefully annotated it in that lovely red-bound booklet that I gave you. And it's not confusing. It's a good time. So we'll go through that next. All right. Have a good one, folks. Thanks for watching.